Well, good evening. We are in the book of 1 Peter, chapter 4, verse 9. We will finish it sometime this century. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9. And following on the verse that we covered last week about loving one another, and love covering a multitude of sins, one of the practical ways that Peter commands that we love one another is by being hospitable. And so in the verse we're going to cover tonight, verse 9, he says, show hospitality to one another. And just to prove to you that Peter is a human, as he's writing this, he says, without grumbling. And so I wanted to talk tonight a bit about what is hospitality, how do we do it well. I think there's aspects of hospitality that we kind of understand in 21st century America, but there's a lot that we maybe miss because we're so far removed from first century culture and really the way they thought about hospitality. But then there's also aspects of hospitality that are just kind of acultural. It's not about doing it exactly the way it was done in first century Palestine or first century Rome or whatever, but just what does this look like? What does this practice look like? So first, I want to start with the why. Why should we be hospitable other than the fact that it's commanded in the Bible twice to all believers, so here and Romans 12. It's also commanded of pastors specifically and elders that they be hospitable, so your church leadership, and also widows who are deserving of being supported by the church in their widowhood should be women who have been hospitable, raised godly children, and specifically washed the saints' feet. So this is one of the practices of someone who's a mature saint, who's followed Jesus over decades, is that they've been hospitable. And I think that applies, obviously, not just to widows, but essentially it's saying any believer that's worthy of kind of reverence and respect is somebody who, as a younger person, is being hospitable. So us younger people should be hospitable so that we're worthy of respect when we're older. So, other than that, other than the fact that the Bible commands it, which in and of itself should be a good enough reason to be hospitable, why should we be hospitable? I want to argue for three things to begin with. One is, in our cultural moment where there's so much tech, there's so much temptation to just become isolated and kind of build this bubble of your music, your sermon playlist, your whatever, all this stuff that's about you, your Netflix account. They have Netflix accounts where it's like separate to each individual in the family, right? Like you can be so isolated in your friends group on Facebook that's different than other people, or I guess not Facebook for a lot of people. Now it's TikTok for another month and a half until that gets banned, and Snapchat and Instagram and all this stuff. Probably some of those are even outdated. I don't know what the young people are on these days, but anyways, we can get so isolated in our own worlds. And hospitality, particularly biblical hospitality, is really a call for us to reconnect with each other and reconnect with people that maybe aren't the same as us. And I lost my screen. The second reason is hospitality really requires us to care for each other by meeting practical needs. By meeting practical needs. And so, yes, practically you're feeding someone, you're maybe giving someone a bed for a night or a week, those practical needs. But beyond that, as you're spending time with them, you're actually getting to know more about them and what some of their other needs are that are maybe more than just feeding them a meal for one night. And so you're getting to know someone at a deeper level, and that requires some care. Thirdly, Christ-like hospitality requires, and I say requires because we're going to talk about Luke 14 here in a minute, where Jesus commands and says, don't just invite people that are like you, that are your friends, that you get along with, that like the same kinds of games and movies as you, that like to go hunting just like you. Invite people that are different than you, that are maybe not as well off financially as you. He's talking to rich people specifically in that context. Invite people who are crippled or lame or blind, right? We should invite people that are different than us. And by doing this, it actually breaks down stereotypes of different people groups and allows people who maybe are far from God to enter into Christian community, either with your family or multiple families, and come to experience what Christ-like love is like. The kind of love that we talked about last week. And by the way, Jesus says in John to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse as he's about to die, he says, the world will know that you're my disciples, you're my followers, by your love. How do they see our love? They don't see our love on TikTok. Just telling you right now. The world is not seeing Christians' love on TikTok or through sermons. They see it when they actually get to experience it by entering into spaces where there are other believers. And the best way to do that is for us to invite people into our house that aren't like us. So that's the why, or part of the why. Now, there's a lot of ways we could tackle this. I wanted to kind of tackle the idea of hospitality by essentially looking at 3 paradigm shifts. Essentially, changing the way that our culture predominantly looks at hospitality, which is a way to maybe show off your status, show off your stuff, entertain people, and say instead, what is Peter and the Bible more generally calling us to in hospitality? And so we're going to look at 3 paradigm shifts of hospitality. The first is from individualism to community. From individualism to community. Individualism is, it's all about me, it's about my comfort, it's about my stuff, it's about my privacy, right? It's about my entertainment. And Peter and God is calling us out of that into spaces where we might not be comfortable. In fact, we're called to be accountable, not private, right? Our culture wants to pull us to be more private. So you have private web browsing and you have private like movie accounts and private music and all this stuff where you can go and just kind of, well, your soul can die in a lot of sin because you're by yourself and there's no other believers around you to help hold you to the kinds of standards of holiness that we're called to. And God is commanding us to get out of that individualism and privacy and be a little bit vulnerable and be accountable by entering into real deep relationships. And so, well, how do we do that? There's 4 S's that I want to talk about and 1 F, but I couldn't turn it into an S. But first, we're called, like part of this moving from individualism to community is sharing our space. Sharing our space. You're inviting people physically into your house, your apartment, your whatever space you inhabit, right? And that requires some vulnerability. I don't know about you, but sometimes people kind of come into your house and they're like seeing some of your mess. They're seeing stuff that maybe you're not like talking about all the time at church. They're like, oh, wow, you collect those? That's interesting. That's different, right? And it's a little bit vulnerable letting people into your house. And we kind of have this idea in our culture that like our house is our castle, our fortress, and it should be private or like our private room. And I'm not sure those are biblical ideas. And I think they build walls that keep us from a deep level of spiritual intimacy and vulnerability that we're being called into. So this first area is sharing our space. Second, sharing our stuff, right? That's another hard one. For us, culturally, we want our stuff, and we don't necessarily want to let other people use it. And so it goes against kind of our natural self-centeredness to let other people use our stuff. My wife and I, most of you probably know this, but we've been hosting Afghan refugee families off and on for the past like 4 years. So this goes a bit beyond just having somebody over for dinner one night, but most of the families, we've had people as long as a year, others only a couple weeks, but our average is like 2 or 3 months per family. And so when you do hospitality at that level, not that that's what Peter is commanding here necessarily, but stuff gets broken. We've had holes in our wall, we've had things go missing, things get broken, not because of maliciousness, but just accidents happen. And it takes an attitude shift to be okay with that and to be able to release your stuff and recognize, and this is part of the not grumbling part that we'll get to at the end, but we are stewards of God's stuff. That's really the third paradigm shift. We are stewards of God's stuff. Our culture says this is your stuff and you should be able to do whatever you want with your stuff. But God really, really disagrees with that. I mean, that's what tithing is all about. It's not your stuff, it's God's stuff. And part of tithing is reminding you every month, however often you're tithing, that your money is not your money. It's God's money that God's given you as a gift to use to serve other people, to serve the church. And thirdly, this is probably the hardest thing for me, is sharing your schedule. Sharing your schedule. Because I like to do what I want to do when I want to do it, right? I want to be able to, after a long day at work, kids are in bed finally, Miriam's working on a different project, or maybe Miriam and I are going to do it together, but to be able to kick back and watch a movie, right? And like have some, our culture says me time. Have some me time, right? Or another big kind of thing that gets talked about in our culture is self-care. You got to have time for self-care, because otherwise the mental health breaks down and there's lots of problems with that. I think it's really an important question to wonder how much of what we docket as me time or self-care is biblical. I mean, first of all, is the idea of me time biblical at all? And is the amount that we do biblical? I'm not going to try to answer that, but I think that's worth thinking about, right? Is the proportion of time that you're spending watching the Mariners or watching the Seahawks or like playing Tetris or watching Netflix, or I don't know what you're doing, going hunting, you know, not bad things in and of themselves necessarily, but is that a lot of wasted time that we should be using in community? And then the fourth S, so sharing your space, sharing your stuff, sharing your schedule, the fourth S, sort of an S, is sharing ourselves. Sharing ourselves. And here, we're not just being asked to prep a meal for someone. If it was just that, that wouldn't be that hard. But a big part of hospitality is we're being called to get to know other people that aren't like us, and to be vulnerable, to be accountable, to share stories, to share our story, to hear their story. And that requires a big shift from where our culture tells us you're an individual, you should be able to kind of do your own thing, live your own life. Other people shouldn't really tell you what to do or believe. And God's not calling us to do that. And the last piece, and this is one that I've been wrestling with in my own life more recently since I have kids now, is sharing our family. This is different than sharing yourself because, I think about, so for example, with the Afghan families that we host, a lot of them maybe have different rules around technology. My wife and I are pretty strict about, we don't really, our kids are really young at this point. We don't let them have much screen time at all, and the screen time that we let them have is very carefully controlled. And we're wrestling with, when we're with our Afghan friends, sometimes their kids, their 1-year-old or 2-year-old, are having screen time that's not okay with us. And so how do we tactfully, without burning the relationship, also hold some boundaries for our own family's protection? This is a really, really difficult aspect of the actual kind of where the rubber meets the road in this issue of individualism and community, and how do we, what's this balance between you're trying to protect your family, you're trying to help your kids grow to be Christ-like, but you also want to have these relationships with people maybe that aren't like you? What if you're having a neighbor into your house for dinner that's an atheist? What does that look like when you've got young kids and now they're hearing from somebody that's not a Christian? How do you think about that? Again, I'm not going to try to give the answers here necessarily, but these are important questions to be thinking about when you're thinking about hospitality. Second, so our first shift is from individualism, it's all about me, to it's about community. And you could even say from individualism to mission might be another way of putting that. The second one is from entertainment to care. One really sneaky way that our culture has made hospitality all about us is when hospitality becomes entertainment. There's two aspects to this. One is entertainment is a venue for you to show off how cool and interesting of a person you are, right? Do you see the selfishness there? The other aspect is entertainment becomes more about you as the host than the person or family that you're hosting. And so you're doing things that you like to do, not necessarily things that they might like to do, right? And it becomes, again, it's all about you. And so our culture wants to make hospitality really fancy, and you have to be so tidy and perfect to be able to host. And so if your house doesn't look like this, you can't have people over, right? That's the way our culture thinks about it. And I don't know about you, my house never looks like this. Never, ever. Even when we just cleaned it, it doesn't look like this. I don't know how many of you are Strange Planet fans, but this is one of my favorites. It says, friends are arriving soon. Let us store irregular shapes, inside shapes with flat surfaces. And then the guests arrive, they say, your house is beautiful. And they say, thank you. We own things, but we've hidden them. And, it's not bad to not have your house look like a minefield of Legos when your guests show up. But that's not the essence of what hospitality is about, right? If you just do this, you're not getting to the heart of what Peter is calling us to when he calls us to be hospitable. People have deep needs to be seen, heard, and known. People in this room, your neighbors, your coworkers, anyone that you might have over have deep needs, some more than others, because some are their life is plunging over a cliff more quickly than others. But as humans, we have deep needs to be seen, heard, and known. And a pretty house isn't going to satisfy that soul craving. What people are looking for is deep relationships. They may not know it. They may not be able to articulate that. But that's what people are craving. I want to read you a section. You know my trademark is book recommendations. So I have another book to recommend to you. It's called The Gospel Comes with a House Key by Rosaria Butterfield. Excellent, excellent, excellent book. The best I've ever read on hospitality. And I just want to read you one section to whet your appetite. And because I think she says it better than anyone else I've ever read on why being unfussy about hospitality, but more regular, when you're not so fussy, you can do hospitality more. Why this is so important. Here's Rosaria Butterfield in The Gospel Comes with a House Key. She says, speaking up, by the way, she's talking about her and her husband, who's a pastor. They invite people over to their home for Sunday lunch after church. She writes, sin demands isolation. While community does not inoculate us against sin, godly community is a sweet balm of safety. It gives us a place and a season where we are safe with ourselves and safe with others. My favorite day of the week is the Lord's Day, and I want to share that day with others. Kent, my husband, and I open our home after worship to anyone who will come. We must. We remember what it is like to be a new Christian, to be single, to have secrets that get you alone and torment you, and to have no place to go after worship. The odd tearing apart of the body of Christ as each retreats to her own corner or clique, while the benediction still rings in the air. It is an act of violence and cruelty to people in your church who routinely have no place to belong, no place to need and be needed after worship. Worship leaves us full and raw, and we need one another. We live in a world that highly values functionality, but there is such a thing as being too functional. When we are too functional, we forget that the Christian life is a calling, not a performance. Hospitality is necessary, whether you have cat hair on the couch or not. People will die of chronic loneliness sooner than they will of cat hair in the soup. Know that someone is spared another spiral binge of pornography because he is instead playing Connect 4 with you or walking the dogs or jumping on the trampoline. Know that these small things that you may take for granted have been the Lord's appointed way of escape for a brother or sister. Know that someone is spared the fear and darkness of depression because she is needed at your house. Always on the Lord's day, the day she is never alone, but instead safely in community, where her place at the table is needed and necessary and relied upon. Know that someone is drawn into Christ's love because the Bible reading and singing that come at the close of the meal include everyone. And it reminds us that no one is scapegoated in this Christ-bearing community. Isn't that powerful? That's what hospitality is all about. That's why it's so important. Even to believers need that kind of deep community care. Hospitality can't be about entertainment, primarily. Not that you can't play a game or watch a movie or do something fun, have a nice meal. Those are great. But if that's the focus, it will actually pull you away from deep connection Like, have you ever been to somebody's house where they were so focused on the food prep or all the work that goes into making it happen that they missed out on even talking to you and asking deep level questions? Like, this is a Mary Martha issue, right? That Martha, I always forget which of the two. It's Martha, right? That is too busy cooking. And Jesus calls her out. Now, I will say in Martha's defense, like, this is a weird headspace time for her because her brothers just died. So this is not a normal hospitality situation. But the point remains, we can get so busy with the functional side, the practical side of hospitality, that we miss caring for people. And so maybe what that means is instead of having like a 12-course meal, have spaghetti, right? Do something simple that allows you to take time to really invest in the people and care about the people that you're hosting. At the same time, we talked about this earlier, Jesus is calling us not just to invite our friends, right? So entertainment, because entertainment is all about our comfort, generally it's inviting people that we like to hang out with and our friends. And that's good, there's a place for that, that's not wrong. But if that's the only hospitality you do, well, you're disobeying Jesus, because he says, we'll read it here in Luke 14, 12 through 14, he also said to the man who had invited him, isn't this a nice thing to say to your host? When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. When you host people that aren't like you, either in their beliefs or their background, socioeconomic or ethnic, your attitude matters a lot. And this is where we'll transition into the last paradigm, which is gratitude instead of grumbling. Gratitude instead of grumbling, right? Peter says, be hospitable, but don't grumble. Watch out, because it's such a temptation to think, okay, well, I have to do this, so I'm going to do it, but I might not like it, right? But we're commanded to not grumble. So what does this look like? Well, first of all, I mean, if you've had some times where you've grumbled when you're hosting, or you try to host next week because you're like, it's in the Bible, I guess I should do this, and your attitude is not like perfect, I have been there, and I'm still sometimes there, I'll be honest. Especially sometimes with some of our guests that are at our house for like 6 months, it can be a little like, I want my space back. But like, we get an opportunity to show Jesus' love to people that aren't like us. And that is part of where we're in the Great Commission. We're Jesus' people. And our mission in the world is to both nourish believers, right? Nourish physically with food, but more importantly, nourish with community, and also be a light to non-believers. And both of those things you can do through hospitality, and should do through hospitality. That is a privilege. Yes, it's work, but it's a privilege. Like, raising kids is a lot of work, but it's also a privilege. Having a full-time job is a lot of work, but it's also a privilege. Getting to serve in church is a lot of work. Getting to sing in the cantata is a lot of work, but it's also a privilege, right? Hospitality, same thing. It's a lot of work, but it's a privilege where we get to serve our King Jesus. And at the same time, remembering we are stewards. And this stuff, this space, our kids, our time is not our own. It's Jesus's. And so we should be grateful for the stewardship, that Jesus gives us another day to breathe. He gives that to us not just for us to squander with trivial activities, but to make relationships and to help people on the journey towards the kingdom. That's what hospitality is all about. So, in a world that values privacy and individualism and convenience and comfort, as Christians, we're called to be radically different and to serve people, to welcome people that are not like us with the love of Jesus. I want to close by looking at the next two verses that we'll cover in January, because Peter actually fleshes out a little bit how we do hospitality well and cast the vision. He says, so this is the very next verse, right after he says, without grumbling. He says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another. Well, like in hospitality, certainly you're serving one another with the gifts that you have. For some people, it's cooking fabulous meals. For others, it's talking. We all have different gifts. As good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks the oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies. In order that in everything God may be glorified. This is the vision, right? This is what hospitality is all about. Not that I look good, but that He looks good, that He's glorified. Through Jesus Christ, to Him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we are so grateful that you give us this privilege to share our lives and our homes and our food and our beds and our spaces, our families with people in our lives, whether they be friends here at church or maybe new guests here at church, people that we just met at the cantata this morning or will meet tomorrow night, or neighbors or coworkers or others that you somehow allow us to encounter in our lives as connections that we can help care for and hear their stories, and they can hear our stories. And part of our story, central to our story, is how you have loved us and saved us. And that we can only stand where we stand today because of your great mercy and grace in our life. God, and I pray that we would catch the vision to be hospitable. Not to have a fancy and neat house and a perfect meal, but rather to care for people where they're at and hear their stories and love them and bring them into safe spaces with Christian community and our family and others here at church where they can be drawn into the love and light of your gospel.